Okay, in this section, we're going to factor trinomials of the form ax squared plus bx plus c using factor by grouping. So in the last section, we factored these trinomials where the coefficient of x squared was not 1, where the leading coefficient was not 1, by trial and error. So there's another method you can use, and that is factor by grouping. It is very similar to the factor by grouping you did in a previous section where we had 4 terms. So that's the idea we're going to use here. Okay, now before we do this, let's kind of review a couple of problems. So we're going to factor, and let's say we want to factor 2y cubed plus 5y squared, 2y cubed plus 5y squared minus 4y minus 10. All right, so remember this polynomial has 4 terms, and so we want to factor this by grouping. Now, first of all, you want to look to see what the GCF is. So the GCF here of all 4 terms is 1. Okay, so since the GCF is 1, we're going to go directly to grouping the first 2 and then grouping the last 2. Now, in this first group, remember how we did this? We looked for a common factor, the GCF of this group. So the GCF of this group is y squared. So we factor out a y squared, and I'm left with y squared times 2y. Y squared times 2y will give me 2y cubed. So remember the distributive method, plus y squared times 5. Y squared times 5 will give me 5y squared. All right, in the second group, remember that you look at the sign of that third term. So in the second group, I'm going to factor out a negative, and in this case, it will be 2. I'm going to factor out negative 2, and I'm left with 2y, because negative 2 times 2y is a negative 4y, and then a negative 2 times a positive 5, negative 2 times positive 5 is a negative 10. And so from these two groups, the GCF is 2y plus 5. So I'm going to factor out 2y plus 5, so 2y plus 5 times y squared minus 2. And so that is the answer to this problem. Okay, so review another one. This is number 1. So let's suppose this time I have 3x squared minus x, and then plus 6x minus 2. So let's review one more problem, and then we'll go to the section. So from this first group, well, first of all, the GCF is 1. Always look for the GCF. If GCF is other than 1, remember we factored out the GCF. So we're going to group the first 2 and group the last 2. From the first group, I can factor out an x, and I'm left with 3x times 3x. X times 3x is 3x squared, minus x times 1 is x, or in this case, negative 1. X times a negative 1 is negative x. Over here, I'm going to factor out a positive 2, and I'm left with 3x minus 1 again. So 2 times 3x is 6x. 2 times a negative 1 is a negative 2. And then from these two groups, this group and this group, see they have a 3x minus 1 as a common factor. So we take out the 3x minus 1, and I'm left with x plus 2. All right, so that's the answer to that one. Okay. All right, now let's review how we approached section 6.2. So this is a review from a previous section. So remember in a previous section where we want to factor, again, this is all reviews. Let's say we want to factor x squared plus 11x plus 30. So remember what we did. If you notice, this leading coefficient is 1. So what we asked ourselves was, I want to find two numbers whose product is this constant. Remember the product. So the product is this constant, so in this case a positive 30, and whose sum was the coefficient of that middle term. So I wanted the sum to be 11. Okay? And so again, we found two numbers whose product is 30, something like, let's say, 10 and 3 is a positive 30. But when I add 10 and 3, when I look at the sum, I get 13, and that's not what I wanted, so I wanted 11. So if you think about it, the only two numbers that work would be 6 and 5, because 6 times 5 is 30, and when I add them up, the sum is 11, which is what I wanted. So these are the two numbers I used. And so then the answer would be, when we factor this, x squared plus 11x plus 30 can be factored as x plus 6 times x plus 5. All right, now remember though, you always check yourself using the FOIL method. Remember the first times first, FOIL. X times x is x squared. The last, a positive 6 times a positive 5 is 30. Okay, now let's check the outer and the inner. The outer is 5x, the inner is 6x. And when I combine like terms, I get 11x, which is what I wanted. So that's the answer. Okay, so all of this was a view of things that are needed in order to do the following problems that we're about to do by grouping where the coefficient is no longer 1. Okay, but we're going to use the same idea, product and sum, to do these problems. So this is called the AC method. So the AC method. So we're going to factor by grouping. Using the AC method. Okay, now remember the trinomial is going to have this form, ax squared plus bx plus c, and so hence the phrase AC. So remember, when we did this problem here in the previous section, we said we wanted the product to be this constant. Okay, so we're going to extend, and remember the leading coefficient is 1. So we're going to extend it to where the leading coefficient is not 1. So I'm still going to use the idea of product and sum. I will still use the idea of product and sum just like I did this. Okay, except this time the product is not just as constant. It's going to be the product of the leading coefficient and the constant. So look at this product here. So the product has to be a times c, and the sum will be the coefficient of the middle term, just like before. So the sum will be 11. So the product will be a times c, and the sum will be 11. So the AC method. Okay. All right. So let's look at an example. So all these will be factored. All right. So let's look at this example. Suppose we wanted to factor. Let's see. Let's suppose we wanted to factor. All right, suppose we want to factor this problem. 3x squared plus 14x plus 8. All right, so 3x squared plus 14x plus 8. Now we're going to do this using the AC method. So in the worksheet that deals with this section, make sure you use the AC method. Don't use trial and error like we did before. I want you to use the AC method. So it's another method of doing this. Another method of factoring. So we're going to look at the product. So I want the product to be AC. So A is 3, C is 8. So it will be 8 times 3, which is 24. So I want the product to be 24. And I want the sum to be B, which is 14. So the sum is B, the product is AC, and the coefficient of the x term is 14. All right. Now, before we begin, just make sure you look for GCF first. So always look for GCF. The GCF here is 1. So let's find two numbers whose product is 24. So something like 8 times 3. But when I look at 8 times 3, that is 24, but the sum of 8 and 3 is 11, and that's not what I wanted. Okay? So let's look at 12 times 2. So if we look at 12 times 2, 12 times 2 is 24, and the sum is 14, which is what I want. So this will be what I'm going to use. Okay? All right, now listen carefully. How are you going to do this? So it's see, this part here is very similar to this part here. Nothing's changed. So look how similar this is. Nothing has changed except this time, since the coefficient is not 1, you're going to say 3 times 8. All right? If the coefficient was 1, you would say 1 times 8, which is 8. And that's how and really that's how, in the previous section, you could have said 1 times 30 is 30. But since the leading coefficient was 1, you just use a product of a constant term. Okay, so what we're going to do is since I'm talking about grouping, I'm going to do this by grouping. We're going to rewrite the middle term. We're going to rewrite the middle term using these two numbers. Okay, so here's how it's going to look. You're going to rewrite the first term, so 3x squared. 14x will be, remember this is a positive 12 and a positive 2, so positive 12x. Don't just say 12, because remember this is not 14, this is 14x. So I got to say 12x plus 2x. So you see 12x plus 2x is 14x. I'm getting it from here. And then plus the 8. So I wrote this trinomial using 4 terms, where the middle two terms here, when added up, gives us this middle term, and these two terms here are arrived from these two numbers whose product is 24 and whose sum is 14. And then you just group. So the rest of this is just grouping, just like you did before. So from this first group, I can factor out a 3x, and I'm left with 3x times x is 3x squared, plus 3x times 4 is 12x. And then from that second group, I can factor out a 2, and I'm left with x plus 4, because 2 times x is 2x, 2 times 4 is 8. And then from here, I can factor out an x plus 4, and I'm left with 3x. So when I factor out this x plus 4, I'm left with 3x plus, and then when I factor out this x plus 4, I'm left with 2, and there's your answer. You are done. So that's how you do that one. So just as a review, you can use the product sum as before, except this time we're going to extend, is be an extension because the leading coefficient is not 1. So you're going to say A times C gives us the product that I need, and then the sum is still the coefficient of the middle term. And you just find two numbers, and so once you find those two numbers, you rewrite that middle term using those two numbers, and then you group, and then you're done. Okay? All right, so let's look at another one. So number 2, let's suppose we had, suppose we had 8x squared. Let's do this one. 7x squared minus 4x minus 11. So 7x squared minus 4x minus 11. All right, so again, we're going to use the AC method. We're using the AC method. So I'm going to find two numbers whose product, remember AC, so whose product is 7 times negative 11. Remember this is negative 11 now. So 7 times negative 11, so that means negative 77, and whose sum is B, the coefficient of the x term, which is negative 4. Not 4, but negative 4. All right, so I'm going to find two numbers whose product is negative 77, because if A is 7 and C is negative 11, I get negative 77. And whose sum is the coefficient of the middle term, which is B. In this case, negative 4. Okay, so now remember, this is negative, so one of these numbers has to be positive, the other number has to be negative. Okay, so let's suppose we say 7 times 11, negative 11. Now let's do negative 7 times 11. So if you agree that negative 7 times 11 is negative 77, but when I add them up, when I look at the sum is a positive 4. I wanted a negative 4, so remember, since these differ by negative signs, then that means all you got to do is switch these signs here. So now I'm going to look at 7 and negative 11. So 7 times negative 11 is negative 77. I'm going to add them up and look at the sum. I get negative 4, and that is what I wanted. So I'm going to rewrite the middle term using those two numbers. Okay? So rewrite the middle term using those two numbers. All right, right here. So we're going to rewrite negative 4x using this. Now, just it does not matter when I rewrite it. It does not matter whether I put the 7 first or the negative 11 first. You're going to see it does not matter. So let's go ahead and rewrite it. So I'm going to have 7x squared. So you just rewrite this. Then you're going to rewrite the middle term using those two numbers. So remember, we're changing this trinomial to 4 terms. So I can do factoring by grouping. So plus 7x minus 11x minus 11, so minus 11x, and remember this is negative 4x, so these two terms here have an x in it, because 7x and a negative 11x does give us a negative 4x. And just rewrite this term minus 11, and then the rest of this is just grouping. Okay, group. I can take out a 7x from here, so that's the GCF of this term is 7x. I'm left with x plus 1. 7x times x is 7x squared. 7x times 1 is 7x. Now over here, remember, take out the negative, and then GCF is 11. And you're left with x, because a negative 11 times x is negative 11x, plus 1, because negative 11 times 1, positive 1, is negative 11. And then finally, your answer is, you factor out the x plus 1, and you're left with 7x minus 11. Okay, you can always check yourself. Always check. X times 7x is 7x squared. Go back to the original. The last, remember FOIL, positive 1 times negative 11 is negative 11. And when you look at the outer, negative 11x, and you look at the inner, 7x, remember that's this right here, or these two terms here, I do get negative 4x. Okay, so that's your answer. Now, remember, I said it didn't matter whether you put the 7 here, 7x here, or 7x here. So notice what happens. I'm going to rewrite this just to show you. So I'm going to get 7x squared. I'm going to rewrite this using minus 11x plus 7x. So again, it doesn't matter. I could have put either one of those, any of these orders, minus 11. All right, group the first two. I can, this time the GCF of the first group is x. I'm left with 7x minus 11. And over here, the GCF is a positive 1, and I have 7x minus 11. And then I can factor out the 7x minus 11. And when I factor out the 7x minus 11, I'm left with x. So when I take this out, I'm left with x. Oops. Let me do this. So I'm left with x plus 1. And that's what we got here. Okay? So it does not matter where the order in which you put these for the middle term. Okay. All right, let's look at one more, just in case you need one more with this. So let's look at this problem. So we have negative 25x plus 12 plus 12x squared. So negative 25x plus 12 plus 12x squared. Now remember, we want to put this in descending order to see how the terms are not in the proper order. So it's not of the form ax squared plus bx plus c. So remember the word descending order. Let's put this in descending order. And so when I put this in descending order, I'm going to get 12x squared minus 25x plus 12. All right, so 12x squared minus 25x plus 12. Okay, so the GCF here of all three terms is 1. So I'm going to just go and find the product of A and C. So A is positive 12, B is positive 12, and I get 144. And I want the sum to be a negative 25. So I want the sum to be a negative 25. Okay? All right, now for this one, see how the number's not that small? So you may need to use your calculator to come up with some products. So now remember one of our rules. Remember, if the last sign's positive, remember when we factor, if the last sign is positive, that means that the middle sign, that these two signs here will be the same, because a negative times a negative is a positive. A positive times a positive is a positive. But we want that middle sign to when we do the outer inner, to be negative. So that means that both of these signs will have to be negative. So when I do this product, and I find two numbers whose product is positive 144 and whose sum is negative 25, the only way that can happen is if they're both negative. So as we go through this, they all have to be negative. Okay? All right, so let's just go ahead and rewrite this. All right, so here we go. Now these numbers are going to be, this is not a small number, so we are going to have to use a calculator. Okay, so let's say I want to do negative 12 and negative 12. Okay, so negative 12 times negative 12 is a positive 144, but when I add them up, when I add this up, I get a positive 24, and that's not what I wanted. I wanted a negative 25. So we got to try some other numbers. Now it might help. If you kind of look at factors of 144. So like 12 times 12. If you look at 12, that is what, 6 times 2, and there's another 6 times 2. And then if we look at 6, that is 3 times 2, 3 times 2. So I have these prime numbers. All right. So you may want to use those prime numbers to multiply them out to maybe come up with two numbers whose product is 144. Okay. So let's think about this. Let's see. We could say, let's see. This is 6 times 2. We already did that. That's a 12. So we could say 3 times 2 times 3. So in other words, what I'm saying is this. 144 is 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, and then times 3 times 3. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So when I multiply these up, I will get 144. So what I want to do is I want to take, let's say, these two numbers multiplied by, actually, let's just say 9. So that's 9 times 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8, 8 times 2 is 16. Now again, if I multiply 9 by 16, I should get 144, because that's how I did the factor tree. So 9 times 16 is 144. And let's look at the sum. So if I add these two, if I add them, I get 16 plus 9, which is 25. And that's what I wanted, except I wanted negative. Okay, so it looks like the two numbers that work will be 144. Now, it just happened that I chose the right pairs or the right sets of numbers. So it could be that you may have to try a few more to see which works. But on your test, or on your worksheet rather, this number will not be that bad. It'll be a smaller number, so it won't take you long to figure out how to multiply these two numbers to come up with the right sum. Okay, so it looks like what's going to work will be negative 9 and negative 16. So negative 9 times negative 16 is positive 144. And when I add them up, I do get a negative 25. Okay, so we'll just rewrite this, and then rewrite the middle term. So I get 12x squared minus 9x. Again, it doesn't matter what order. Minus 9x minus 16x, and then plus 12. So from the first group, I can factor out a 3x, and I'm left with 4x, because 12x times 4x is 12x squared, minus 3, because 3x times a negative 3 is a negative 9x. Now over here, though, remember you're going to factor out a negative factor. So here I'm going to take out a negative 4, factor out a negative 4, and I'm left with negative 4 times 4x is 16x minus, and then negative 4 times a negative 3 Negative times a negative is a positive. So negative 4 times a negative 3 will give me that positive 12. And so I'm on the right track because these two groups have the same common factor in parentheses. So we're going to take that out, factor it out, and I'm left with 3x minus 4. So 4x minus 3 times 3x minus 4. And so there's your answer. And again, always check. Very quickly you can check this. First times first, 4x times 3x is 12x squared. The last, negative 3 times a negative 4 is a positive 12. And then you just got to check to make sure you get that middle term. So the outer is negative 16x. The inner is negative 9x. And when I add them up, I do get negative 25x. Okay? All right, now that should be enough to do the worksheet or part of the worksheet. What we're about to do now in the next video, what we're going to do is, remember in all these three problems, the GCF of the polynomial, this polynomial, this polynomial, this polynomial was 1. Okay, now we got to look at, well, what happens if the GCF is not 1? Let's suppose it's something other than 1. Well, we did that already. You just factor it out. But let's just do a couple more problems in the next video on this. So this is going to end this video.